Welcome to the Introduction to Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. Here we are looking at Chapter 1. For anyone who's just picking this up, there's a book that this is following. If you'd like a copy of the book, there's a link below. You can get it in digital, hardcover, softcover, or Audible, or Spanish. So if anybody's interested, the link is below. So this is chapter 1 is an overview. So as an overview, we're going to touch on kind of the whole book, right, in a sense, but it's not going to go into any detail. So if you're looking for the references or citations, right, you have to look ahead to the other videos that are made on the specific chapters, and beyond that, the book, right, there's something like a 75-page bibliography. So there's a lot of citations, but they're not all in this introduction YouTube video. Okay. Just to be clear, for those who are picking up this video or are not going to get the book, I just want to make it very clear that this book is not claiming that transgender people are mentally ill. I know that's a very touchy subject, and this gets addressed throughout the book, but in case this is all you see, just so you know right from the start, that's not the claim of this book. Now, we do look at the umbrella term, the idea that transgender is an umbrella. Are there some people who claim to be transgender who are mentally ill? There are some, right? Because there are some people who are diabetic who are mentally ill. There are some people who have cancer who are mentally ill. Mental illness goes across the spectrum, so there's that part. Now, does mental illness cause some people to believe that they're mentally ill? There is always a percentage. It's impossible to say that nobody who's mentally ill hasn't seen transgender stuff in the media and says, that's me, right? There's people who hear about Jesus and then they think they're Jesus. There's people who think that they're the Messiah or the Antichrist, or they're the devil, or they're Elvis, right? There's always some group of people who are already mentally ill. They see stuff and they believe that it's them, right? So you can't discard that nobody is mentally ill who's transgender, or that transgenderism isn't caused by mental illness for some people. But the point of this book is not to say that this is the majority. Outright, it is not the majority, right? Statistically and medically proven, it's not the majority of people who are identifying as transgender who are claiming who it originates from mental illness. But I think it is important to look at the umbrella, right? And I think we look at transgender as a unified thing, right? People are transgender. It's an identity, and it's innate in some way. But really, it's an umbrella term that identifies a lot of different types of people and a lot of different causes for these identifications. And the biggest one being gender dysphoria, right? That's kind of the medical diagnosis. But even that is an umbrella term, right? Even that, right? Why are people dysphoric about their gender? Well, it could be because they were raped, right? Then other psychological trauma, right? That could be a possibility. Could be depression, could be other anxieties. It could be something in the brain, right? All of these are possibilities of creation of gender dysphoria, right? So we're talking about umbrella terms, which is why it's very difficult to generalize, right? We can't just say, well, all transgender people are like this, or that, it's all about egoism or all about narcissism. Well, there probably is some subgroup under the umbrella where it is about egoism and narcissism, but that doesn't mean it's true for all members of that group, because there can be different causes, right? So I think that's very important, and that's a big point within this book, right? Is that it's not a unified diagnosis. It's not a unified movement. It's also why there's a problem with it being, the government puts it under the the Civil Rights Act, or 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's problematic because what you're saying is this is a protected group of people, but it's not a group. In some ways, it's not a collective, or it's not there's no common cause, so it's kind of hard to label it as a group and give it rights when it could be somebody's mentally ill, could be the person experienced sexual trauma, right? So it's again, it's just difficult to unify it. I think it's healthier to look at it as an umbrella. Now there are sub-umbrellas, right? So the one is the androphilic, which I know people hate, and I probably shouldn't have put it at the beginning, but I think it's very important. This is associated with people with early onset gender dysphoria, typically, right? So people at a very young age who are identifying in some way as somebody of the opposite gender, opposite sex. So a little boy who acts as if he is a girl, or a little girl who acts as if they are a boy, and it kind of is consistent throughout. In some ways you can look at this as they sometimes call it homosexual type transgender, right? A little boy that's so gay, he's a girl. A little girl that's so gay, she's like a boy, right? And kind of in that spectrum of heterosexual to homosexual, it goes, the tendencies have gone beyond homosexual to actually identifying as a person of the opposite sex, with androphilia. There's a lot on this in chapter 6, so jump ahead to that if you're interested. But numbers anywhere from 63 to 94% of people desist who at an early age identify as somebody of the opposite sex, right? 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds who act as a member of the opposite sex. The vast majority, with time, just with time, they desist. And a lot of these studies only go up to 15 years old or teenage years. If we were to look at it into adulthood, probably even more will desist, right? This is quite logical. So the amount of people who are full-fledged adults who are androphilic is about 0.1% of the population, right? So a very small percent of the population, although not, they do exist, right? When you're talking 340 million people in America, 0.1% is still a significant number of people. This is a group which we typically think of when we have thought of transgender in the past, right? Before 2010, right? This is probably a large group of the people who we would have been thinking about. Not exclusively, but a large group, right? And they would have been a very small percentage, and the proper response is extreme compassion, right? That's the proper response to people who have this kind of natural abnormality, right? How, this is something that a 4-year-old has, right? This is something that is developed very naturally, whether it's nature or nurture or whatever the circumstances. It's not something that is part of any type of activism of any kind, or this is just who they are, right? So the response is typically extreme levels of compassion. There is also within other cultures, more integration, like the Lady Boys of Thailand or the Kinner of India, right? They're typically talking about this group of androphilic individuals. It's most closely to the idea of being a boy with a female brain or a female with a male brain. This is most typically that situation. Again. So the next group is autogynophilic, which are usually later in life, typically heterosexual men, and it's related to some type of cross-dressing or transvestitism. They're often fairly masculine men who marry women, have children, can often be in the military or in sports or police officers, people like this. And they much later on in life come out as transgender, although they still love the women in their lives. Usually it leads to the end of their marriage, though, because the wife did not sign up for that. The feminists often criticize them as saying, well, they look like a trucker in a dress, or a man in a dress. This is often how you see it, right? Caitlyn Jenner is probably an autogynophilic, perhaps, as an example, right? Even with millions of dollars worth of surgery, it's kind of still, they have kind of a masculine element about them, right? The way they approach the world, the way they approach femininity, the way, right? There's a desire, but there's not a natural inclination. Unlike androphilic, where, the young boy is so feminine, he acts like a girl very early on in life. The parents are very well aware of this. Autogynophilic, usually nobody knows, right? The person comes out at 60 years old as a woman, and you go, didn't see that coming, right? So very different. So what's the point of raising this? It's not to upset people, to put people in categories, but it's to acknowledge that there could be different causes, right? There seems to be a different cause for androphilic being almost rooted in a type of homosexuality, right? The gender element of the brain seems to have been off in some way, right? I think that's fair enough to say. Versus the autogynophilic, where they seem very naturally men, very naturally masculine, their orientation, heterosexual, kind of all the boxes kind of point to men, right? And then all of a sudden they say, but I identify as a woman. It's kind of it's a different thing. It's just a different thing, right? It's under the umbrella of transgender, but it's not that similar, right? It's similar, but not that similar, right? It's at least notable enough to make a different distinction, right? Under the umbrella, right? There are different categories. This is very unpopular today. I'll put that out there, although it's because we have been very sensitive and we don't want to offend anyone, and if the person says they're a woman, then they are a woman, and we shouldn't ask any questions. But if you start to ask questions, you can start to see these different groupings, right? Might not be popular, but it's what psychiatrists and medical professionals should be doing, but because of ideology, no longer do, right? We also have late onset gender dysphoria under this umbrella. This is 75% or more, usually teenage girls who show no signs of being transgender before their teenage years, and then all of a sudden 14, 15 years old, they start identifying as boys. Often their peer group, there's some connection between their peer group also identifying that way. Parents do not see it coming, and it seems to be a social contagion. It has similar elements with the social contagion. Now, there could always be an undiagnosed early onset gender dysphoria, right? It could be. But the rate of this happening and the testimonies of the parents seem to point to the idea that, no, my little girl has always been girlish, and all of a sudden friends have come out as trans, and now she identifies as trans, or she got sucked into watching YouTube videos and other things in this, and now she's identifying in a different way, and she was autistic, and she dealt with other mental health issues, and this is the result. This is late onset gender dysphoria, sometimes called rapid onset gender dysphoria, if it seems to have come out of nowhere, right? Again, a different possible cause, right? And all of a sudden, a teenage girl identifies as transgender when 3 other people on her tennis team identifies as transgender. Maybe it's different than the child who, at 4 years old, always identified as the person of the opposite sex, right? That is different. Also different than a man who comes out at 50 years old who's been married and identifies as a member of the opposite sex and has none of those characteristics. This is a large enough group of people who have similar enough traits that we can put this under a different umbrella to try to understand it, right? This would be important. Again, just to say it's all the same, it would be a disservice to trying to find appropriate therapeutic treatments and to understand it, right? It's important to understand it accurately. The other group is the gender theorists. Now, gender theorists make up people who are transgender, who identify as transgender, and people who don't identify as transgender, right? You don't have to be... Gender theorists are everywhere, right? So more often than not female, but not exclusively. More heavily with men, homosexual men, right? And more than heterosexual men, but not exclusively. And they have an ideology. I think this is a good line. Gender theory is a social and political ideology attempting to deconstruct the family, economy, government, church, and all classical elements of the culture with the hope to rebuilding a superstructure in their own image. I think that's in a nutshell. I think I wrote that myself too, since I didn't cite it or anything. I think that is a good way of looking at it, right? It's not about what are you really. It's about being not limited by any of the classical elements of our culture, right? It's saying, don't limit me by my sex, don't limit me by my gender, don't, there's a certain level of Marxism in there, although the term gets overused, but there is a Marxist element to some of this, of a complete deconstruction, right? The attempt is in some ways to sow chaos in order to deconstruct it and to think, well, if we rebuilt it with this ideology, we'd all be better off, which is very disconnected from nature, right? You end up with people on the extreme side of this pushing for everyone is gender non-binary, and we come up with our pronouns and our identities by the day, and we're in these polyamorous relationships, and we're raising children in a commune, and all of it. Like it ends, and we should all be communism is the better way of doing it, and unless you're a lesbian, black, handicapped person who's autistic, you shouldn't be running anything. You shouldn't have a voice, right? It's kind of an extreme ideology. Again, there are people who identify as transgender who fit under this category, right? There's a large enough group of them that they deserve their own little umbrella under the larger umbrella. But this is very different than people who, again, little boy, little girl, 4 years old, who acts and behaves as a member of the opposite sex, and that persists all the way to adulthood, right? That's extraordinarily rare. But those people are very different than gender theorists, right? It's not the same member of the umbrella. It's also, again, why laws protecting people who identify as transgender are very that's a tough thing, right? Because it protects those people who, that 0.06% of people or 0.1% of people who say, I've always felt this way. I've always been this way. I'm a member of the opposite sex. I feel it within me, and I've always expressed that, right? That those types of people, I think we have more sympathy for trying to protect under the law, right? Somebody who studies gender theory, and now all of a sudden they have blue hair, and they are in a polyamorous relationship, and they're gender non-binary and fluid, and now identify as transgender. We don't need to protect those people under the law, right? We do have to protect them from violence or anything like everybody else, but we don't have to protect their ideology or their identities under the law, because they just made it up, which is fine to make it up, but if you just make something up, it shouldn't be protected under the law. And if you disagree with them, you are committing a hate crime. You've acted violently towards them because you've disagreed with their worldview, right? These are very different categories, and they shouldn't be treated the same, right? I think that's clear. Again, I just went through this, so I won't go through it again, but the 4 proposals that we have to treat people differently. The 4 proposals is early onset gender dysphoria, since a very large percentage, right, a very high rate of people who have early onset gender dysphoria desist. They stop naturally on their own by the time they reach adulthood, the vast majority, in fact. then the proper response is wait and see, or help them to assimilate into their biological sex. That is the most practical and the most reasonable thing to do. Right? Going along with it, affirming it, even socially transitioning. Once you've told this to everybody in the school, and everybody's changed the name, and you've gone down this road, for the kid to say, actually, that's not me. Now let me go backwards and be, this is actually an added stress, right? This could be more harmful than just saying, just be neutral, right? Be neutral for a while and see where this goes, right? Because most likely they're just going to outgrow it. Statistics show, and this might be upsetting to some people, but the majority of people from this group later in life, right, once they reach adulthood, they end up identifying as homosexual people or gender non-conforming, but not transgender, if they don't receive treatment and hormones and all these other things. So the little boy that acted so feminine, well, he becomes a gay man, right? This is the thing that most likely happened. Probably isn't going to go from the extremely feminine to all of a sudden super macho, right? There does seem to be a connection between being extremely feminine and homosexual. Now, there are very masculine men who are also homosexual, but you find very few extremely feminine males who are also heterosexual. Less likely. I don't know. I don't have any statistics to back that up, but just anecdotally, I think that appears to be true. Late onset gender dysphoria, right? This would be the teenage girls who are identifying as boys all of a sudden, and there's boys who do it too, but it's more often than not girls. This is, again, you just wait and see, and most likely they'll outgrow it. The statistics show that after 16 years old, the rates of identifying this way drop off considerably at gender clinics. It kind of reaches its peak 15, 16 years old, and then just drops off. And by the early 20s, people get over it. It would be like goths or emos today, right? People from my generation wearing black and identifying as goths. If you look at them today, they do not, right? They got married, they have children, they have a job, and they moved on with their lives, right? They still might like the same music and stuff, but they don't have the same identity, right? Emo as well, something like that. You eventually outgrow these things, unless we're a society that all of a sudden says, oh, you're transgender, let me give you hormone blockers, let me change your sex, let me remove your breasts, let me do this, right? Then there is permanent effects of this. Gender theorists, right? How do we respond to gender theorists, right? Well, they have a ideology, which is different than a philosophy, right? It's a lesser philosophy, but they have a philosophy, let's say, give them full credit for it. They have a philosophy, and their philosophy is wrong. Not that there's nothing right about it, but it's overwhelmingly wrong because it's very unnatural. It violates our human nature. It lives in an idealism that is self-destructive. It's just not... And what do you do with a bad philosophy? You debate it, and you argue it, and you make your point, right? And you try to convince people of your point. That's what you do with an ideology. Nobody's opinion on it should be protected under the law, right? You can't say this to me because I have protected speech because I'm a protected group of people. That is very unhelpful when it comes to thinking, right? You should be able to discuss ideas. There's no protected group of ideas, right? No matter how bad an idea is, we should be able to debate it, right? You can disagree with white supremacy, but let them say it, and then say your counter argument, and and the truth should prevail, right? That's the idea. So, and lastly, we need to really remove this bigger umbrella, right? The overarching umbrella that we call transgender. We need to remove that because it's an ideology, right? It's an umbrella of an ideology, and it's not helpful for therapy, right? So if a person is androphilic, they need different therapeutic treatments than somebody who's autogynophilic, who needs different treatments than late onset gender dysphoria, different set of responses to somebody who's a gender theorist, right? So putting it all under one umbrella is not helpful, right? That's my proposal. The Catholic approach to this, well, as I say repeatedly, so hopefully people, they at least watch the introduction and it makes sense to them. The most important thing when dealing with this as a Catholic is not to be judgmental, right? That's the big claim. Christians are judgmental, Catholics are judgmental. Anyone who disagrees with the transgender narrative is a transphobe and judgmental, right? That's not helpful to people involved. It's not helpful to the image of the church, right? It's not consistent with the gospel calling of us, right? So, as an example, St. Thomas talks about commutative justice, the justice held between equals within a society, right? And justice is giving them that which is due, right? So what do I owe my Starbucks barista where I go in the morning, right? What do I owe to that barista who's transgender? Do I owe to them a speech about transgender ideology? Right? Do I owe them, to purposefully misgender them so that they know where I stand on the matter? Do I owe them going along with it, right? What specifically do I owe to somebody who is on the same level as I am within society? Well, this is where the gospel comes in that says, judge not lest ye be judged, right? Take the board out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye, right? This type of thing, right? This is the proper approach for equals within society. What is the virtue we owe to them? Friendliness, right? We owe to them within justice, friendliness, right? As a Catholic who goes to a Starbucks and you see a blue-haired, pierced, tattooed, non-binary barista, what do? You say good morning, right? How is your day? How are you doing? Maybe you're wearing your crucifix around your neck, maybe wearing a pin of the Immaculate Heart of Mary or something like this, and you are nice, right? You are pleasant, you are friendly, you're supportive, you're caring, you show charity, right? Caritas. The love you have for God extends to your brothers and sisters in the world because God is in them, right? That is what we owe, right? Now, on the other hand, when we are in a position of authority, valid authority, we have to exercise authority well. And the idea of who am I to judge is not relevant, right? It's not relevant, right? A parent must be a good judge of their family, of their children. A judge must be a good judge of the courtroom, right? A politician must be a good judge of civil society. A doctor must be a good judge of health, right? You can go on, right? A teacher must have good authority and judgment on school matters and child development, right? So we do have to judge in certain positions, right? So right now I'm not married. I'm a teacher, but I'm not in administration. I really have authority over no one, right? I have authority over myself, that's it. So who am I to judge from my position? No one, right? Me, that's it. So I have no judgment because I have no authority, right? People who have authority ought to make right judgments. And if they don't, somebody else who does not have valid authority will be willing to pick up the authority that they laid down. So if the church does not exercise valid authority, expressing the truth about humanity, right? Anthropological truths. The church, who has a responsibility to teach the truth on man, does not, gender theorists will, right? Do they have any authority? No. But they will exercise your authority if you don't, right? Medical professionals who should be making judgments based on medical science and evidence, they are handing over their authority to gender theorists who have a louder opinion on it, and the doctor just wants to mind their own business, and whatever you say, I'll do, right? This is a usurpage of power, authority. What we need is people with proper authority to make proper judgments. That's true. So that's one Catholic approach, right? The church, Catholic organizations need to make proper judgments in the proper way, right? Now, Archbishop Robert Carlson of St. Louis, who you'll hear about quite a bit, wrote a pastoral letter in 2020, which I think is quite good, right? There's always room to improve, but I think it's quite good, right? He says in his letter, for addressing transgender people, the proper approach is to approach transgender people with compassion, right? He says, but if compassion is the first and last thing to say, it is not the only thing to say, right? This is important, right? What should the church be compassionate? Of course. From the start, from the end, throughout, right? The church is compassionate, right? But is that it? Do you just say, well, I have compassion, therefore we make no judgments? And no, the church has the responsibility to make judgments on ideology, right? Not necessarily on medical science, but on terms of ideology, yes, right, for sure. And it's the job of the church to hold into balance medical science, right? If we go down the road of euthanasia or transhumanism, or, it's the job of the church to hold science philosophically in the right order, right? It takes both, right? It takes good science and it takes good philosophy, and the church helps with balancing those, right? It can be a healthy tension between the two sometimes, right? Because science, if it can do something, it wants to do something, and sometimes the right thing to do, the ethical thing, is to withhold doing the thing you could do, right? We could start cloning people, and it's maybe not the best thing to do, right? Could have designer babies, right? But the church's job is to say that's not the best way to approach children, right? It's designer babies. But science is tempted to say, well, we can do designer babies, so maybe we should do, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Now, the ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center teaches, persons claiming to be transgender must be accompanied on their difficult journey with true charity and should be offered ethical, effective therapies based on sound anthropological and scientific evidence. Nailed it, right? That's the line, right? I think they absolutely got it right here. Now, I think they might get it wrong in terms of some of the science later on, which we'll address. They tend to say, well, you have to follow the biology. Well, what if there is a part of the brain which makes a person believe that they are the opposite sex, right? Is person's sex, it's chromosomal, it's physical, morphological, reproductive, right? There's many elements of what sex is. Part of it includes the brain, which is a physical part of the body. So I think sometimes they discard that part too quickly. But I think in terms of their starting point, absolutely right, right? Walk with people on their journey, help them, act with charity, and offer the best effective therapies based on sound anthropology and scientific evidence. And arguably, we are not doing that today. Ethical considerations. Well, one is that there is currently a very fast move to both materialism, this idea of you could just, the body's like clay that you can mold into whatever you want. You don't want breasts, cut them off. You want them later, add them back on, right? You can just change the body. Everything is completely moldable and plastic, right? There's that materialism. The other side, we have this kind of Gnosticism or spiritualism, where we are just spirits, ghosts within a machine, right? We go from we are just material to we are just spirits trapped in a machine, right? There's no hylomorphism, right? The unity of body and soul, that is missing. That is the Catholic response, is the unity of body and soul. Where we are now is both extremes and nothing in the middle, right? That is secular society today. So that is an ethical consideration, right? When you just treat the body as if it's just just an object to be manipulated for your own pleasure, leads to ethical issues, right? Because the body doesn't respond well to that, right? So the other thing, ethical consideration, especially coming from the Digin study or the Obama Medicare, Medicaid response, right? They look at all of the studies and say, well, should the government pay for this, right? Based on all of the studies on transgender, 2016, the Obama decision, and it came out no, right? Look at all the studies. Is this the best response? And the answer is no. The Digin study, the Sweden study, has zero loss to follow-up because they have national healthcare system, and the criteria that they were looking at were objective criteria, right? Cancer rates, heart disease rates, hospitalization rates, suicide hospitalization rates, all of this, and they found very negative outcomes for people who had undergone sex reassignment surgery. Significant lowering of standards of life and standards of care as time went on, especially 10 to 15 years out. People start dying, right, at a much higher rate than people who did not go through sex reassignment surgery. And Sweden's a very open culture, so you can't really blame it on cultural things as much. So that's an ethical consideration, right? If you know that statistically you are likely to die much sooner if you go through the sexual reassignment surgery pathway, well, reason to think that that's not then the best treatment plan, right? At least you should be open to other treatment plans that don't lead to high levels of mortality, right? Said similarly, well-intentioned people of faith create unhelpful treatments in an attempt to heal transgender people of their dysphoria. So this is on the other side. Again, Catholic approach down the middle, right? This is the virtue ethics approach, right? The middle, right? Very Aristotelian of us. On one side is just go for the science, just go for medicalized treatments, link your body with the pharmaceutical industry and go all the way, right? The body can be changed, go for it. On the other side, you have these kind of faith healers who think, well, we'll just, we will treat these people and get them on the right path. The studies show very poor results when we go through faith-based healing approaches to these things. They're not helpful. Much higher suicide rates, and these are not experts. We're dealing with complicated psychological issues that require psychological professionals, therapeutic professionals, people who are trained in this. Even people who have doctorates in this don't succeed all the time. There's still high rates of failure, and it doesn't go well. Untrained people should not be engaged in the field of psychology. So that's a lesson to us, right? And Tarraway and Bars were famous Dutch Catholic doctors who said the same thing, and I use them in the book as well, in chapter 10. This idea that we need science, we need medicine, we need good philosophy, right? We need all three. We need all of it. It's not just philosophy, it's not just theology, it's not just science. It's the coming together, the integration of both that matters. And lastly, in the ethical considerations, is that no medical cure exists for transgender. There is no cure. We can't say, well, therapy solves it. We don't know that, right? Sex reassignment solves it. It's awfully bad data that says to the contrary, right? So we don't have a cure. The best we have is psychic easing, right? Psychological easing of the distress, the dysphoria. That's the best we can do, is to ease the dysphoria. Now, because we're aiming at, right, for cancer, what's the outcome for cancer? Remove the cancer and be cancer-free, right? This is very objective criteria for being successful at your medical treatment. When it comes to psychic easing, there's no objective criteria, really. It's not something that you know that you have accomplished it, right? You can't see it. It's in the head. Therefore, there can be various ways of treating psychic easing. Just like with depression, there's various ways of treating depression. Right? There's dealing with the underlying issue. There's antidepressant medications. Right? There's all different ways of addressing depression. This is more like depression than cancer. Right? We also look at this section, the permanency of sex, which is, again, maybe I shouldn't even go into it too much, but it's part of this ideology that I addressed right from the start. When we think of transgender, it's like, well, the person's stuck in the wrong body, but you have a whole other movement that's going on that's very unhelpful. And just to point out some of this, the issue, right? This is an issue, is people like Rachel Ann Williams, who's a transgender activist, who's identifies as transgender. She'll make claims like that she was a boy who evolved into a woman in adulthood. Right? This is not saying, well, I was always this way, right? Well, I can evolve into a woman, and then I can evolve into a man, and then I can be both a man and a woman, right? This is very ideological, right? This is all ideology is trying to, right, again, deconstruct sex and rebuild it in a different image, right? Okay, if that's what you want to do, that's okay. You make your argument, right? We can debate ideas, but this should not be considered fact, right? It's not a fact. This ideology is not a fact. Another part, social pressures are being put into parents to hormonally and surgically transition children at the early age of 8 years old. Again, we're dealing with an awful lot of ideology in this topic to medically transition 8-year-olds when we don't know a lot about this, right? Very not smart, as they say, right? Especially when you have very high rates of desisting, right? The overwhelming majority of children who are gender non-conforming in their youth will eventually fit into their gender, right? Fit into their sex, and this is healthy, right? This is healthy that they do, right? So have a big move to transition children as early as possible. Very unhealthy. Laws like the state of California and their transgender health bill from 2020, and they have a short section of just kind of data. This very short section, this healthcare bill, they identify that 27% of youth 12 to 17 were in some way transgender, right? 27%, right? This is, again, ideology, right? The Williams Institute of UCLA claim that it's 0.4% of people, right? And that's a scientific study from UCLA. 0.4% identify as transgender, and here this House bill is pointing to something like 27% are possibly transgender in some way, right? This is very ideological, right? When you have the starting point is that 27% of youth are transgender, you will come to very different conclusions with how to treat this than if you had the starting point that 0.4% are transgender, right? You would treat this very differently if your view is 27% versus 4%, right? You would approach this differently, right? If you approach it with the idea that 90% of transgender youth will desist and become cisgender, right? Members of their own biological sex, you'll approach this differently than if you think, oh yeah, 20% of children are transgender and it sticks and it stays with them for life, and as soon as they medically transition, they are much happier, right? If that's your worldview, you're going to handle this very differently. And anyone who says, no, wait, don't do it, you'll be very offended by them, right? Why wouldn't you want these people to be happy, right? That's the argument. Well, because you're not looking at the data, right? If you looked at the data, you would realize that this is not the best way to make people happy, especially 8-year-olds. Okay, this book uses an interdisciplinary approach when looking at this. Again, I'm probably going into too much detail, but some people might only watch this one video if you want a summary of the book. But when somebody claims that they are transgender, philosophically speaking, we have to look, are they talking about sexual desire, right? Saying, well, I feel like a woman. What am I saying? I desire to be a woman, right? Desire. Right? This is what the DSM defines gender dysphoria as, the desire, right? So am I saying I desire to be a woman? Or am I saying I am a woman, right? Very different. Desiring to be something and being something, right? Desire to be a millionaire, I am a millionaire. If I am a millionaire, then I have $1 million. If I desire to be a millionaire, I don't, right? So there's a difference between desiring something and being something. So this is a very important distinction. And lastly, gender theory, right? Just if your view is anyone can be anything, just say it, right? This is very different than either one, right? So this interdisciplinary approach looks at these different elements, right? Because I think from a Catholic perspective, if we're saying the person is ontologically really a woman, then we can go along with it, right? If that is true, right? And this is true sometimes with intersex, right? Somebody could be X, Y, but their full phenotype of their body is female, right? Their body developed as a female, fully opposite sex phenotype, right? So the X, Y was not determinative, right? Did not determine the person to be a male, right? In this regard, the person is ontologically a female, right? So we can go along with that, right? We can agree to that because the person is ontologically female, they are phenotypically a female, right? If somebody is kind of intersex in androgen and sensitivity type of way, of complete one, where they have both sets of organs, right? We don't really know what to do with that, right? We just, we say medical professionals should kind of help determine what the person is, right? But the issue is the ontological is something we can find common ground with, right? We do already with the intersex issue. If transgender people have some type of an intersex brain, we can find room for commonality with, who knows, right? The door might be open a little bit for that. If we're saying it is simply a matter of desire, there's no room to transition based on desire, right? If I want to be black, am I supposed to get pigments and plastic surgeries to make myself look more African? We would say no. That would be ridiculous because it's not who you are. You have to be true to your ontology, who you are, not what you desire to be. Life is about desires. Desires lead to suffering. We hold our desires to the light of truth, which purifies our desires to hold our desires in the right, proper ordering according to right reason, right? Desires do not run our life. Right reason runs our life. And reason, recta ratio, puts our desires in the proper ordering. And that's what leads to happiness, right? This is a fundamental theological principle for us, right? A fundamental philosophical principle as well, right? And gender theory, again, if we can say, well, this is gender theory, then it's not something we need to take seriously medically. It's something that we should debate philosophically. Okay, approaching the end. The method that I take in this, we've got 11 chapters in this book. We deal with both, this is an introduction. I get into some of the philosophy. The next question to kind of lay the groundwork of male and female and the philosophy of it. Very long, chapter 2. Chapter 3, also very long, but it gets into more of the cultural elements of this. And then from there we get into the science, which makes up the bulk of this book. So chapter 4, we get into intersex. Chapter 5, the history of transgender science. 6, Blanchard and the different typologies. 7, into modern medical science. And 4, into neurodevelopmental etiologies that are possible. So we go from 4 to 8. Chapters 4 to 8 are all science. Then we get back into chapter 9, which deals with the issue with children, again, somewhat cultural. And then chapter 10, a heuristic, which then I open up into the Thomism, right? A Thomistic approach. What is the way in which we should approach this issue, right? which goes also into chapter 11, which deals with the virtues, which is very Thomistic. And finally, the creative pathways and the Beatitudo is laid out in the end. And then the idea is you have to, should you change yourself? You say, I'm very unhappy with myself. I want to change. Well, what should be our response? Yes, change. Yeah, right. Only the fool says, well, you are perfect just the way you are, right? You are not perfect just the way you are, right? Unless you are Christ and the Blessed Mother, you are not perfect just the way you are, right? But the thing you need to change is not your breasts, not your hair, not your makeup, not your sex. The thing you need to change is to live a more virtuous life. Period, right? Live more virtuously. You will find happiness, right? Live more virtuously. Whatever other thing you're also dealing with will be made easier by having the virtues, right? You can handle suffering greater when you are virtuous, and you have a virtuous life. It is easier to undergo persecution, suffering, physical illness, etc. Right, and which all then leads into this aiming at Beatitudo, which then requires grace. Right, it's the grace of God which helps heal us, and our own brokenness then, through grace, becomes a point of turning back to God. Right. When we're rich and we have everything, we can just keep running into nihilism. But when we get sick or something goes wrong and something breaks, we stop and we go, why? Help me, right? The brokenness leads us to Beatitudo as well, right? So this is through grace. So this is the last part. I was going to put pictures of the art, but this book is also filled with quite a bit of art. There's art all over it, mostly portraits that I had commissioned, and it's of people who I agree with and people who I do not agree with. People on both sides of the spectrum on this, and I think it's very important that those pictures are in there. One, because anything that's dealing with a Catholic approach should also be beautiful, good, and true, including beauty should be part of it. Another part is it's easy to dehumanize people when we're just looking at names and words on a paper, right? This issue is a very dehumanizing, divisive issue, right? Both sides end up dehumanizing one another. I think if you see the person, if you had to see the person you disagree with, you would have greater sense of compassion for them, right? Because each one of these people, you look at them, old, young, male, female, trans, non-trans, everyone is beautiful in their own way. Everyone has some sense of goodness about them. Even the people who I disagree absolutely with them, they're still good people who are trying their best. They get it wrong. People get it wrong, right? People who are gender theorists, they think that when they when they do this and they go down this road, the world will be a better place. They believe this, right? They believe what they're doing is good. I could look at that and say that will not lead to happiness, right? Some of that's the prudence of age, right? Youth sometimes think that certain things will make them happy, and when you're older in life and you look and you say that will not make you happy, right? If you listen to your 14-year-old self, hanging out at the mall playing video games and eating potato chips and drinking soda all day long would make you happy. Talking to girls on your phone, right, would make you happy. When you get older, you realize that will not make you happy, right? So the artwork in here is to help rehumanize people, and it should be beautiful, right? And so that's why there's so much art in here. Kind of a non-typical thing in a book like this. The philosophy and technology element is also very important, right? So when dealing with Catholic things, we're looking at the technology part. Why should we get involved in this debate anyway? One of it is philosophical. One of it's theological and pastoral, but another part of it is philosophical. Dennett points out there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. Now, this is why we need to be part of the conversation. Why? Because again, I've just said this a few minutes ago. if science can do something, it wants to do it, right? If it can do something, it will do it. If nobody says don't do that, right? Cloning designer babies thing, right? We need to be able to say no, this is not the route we want to go, right? There is a philosophy built into designer babies, right? Part of it is the science. There is a philosophy as well tied into the idea of designer babies, that the human person is completely moldable, changeable, and that there's no intrinsic value of life. It's all a matter of what people value in it, right? I value blue eyes more than brown eyes. I value white skin more than brown skin, right? These are philosophical issues that are problematic when you have the wrong philosophy, right? So we are trying to put into this equation some right philosophy, a different philosophy. Now, the earliest requests for medical solutions never began with how do I get my mind to conform to my body. The earliest questions from the late 1800s, early 1900s was how do I get my body to conform to my mind. This starting point has shaped the way that we've dealt with transgender medicine ever since, right? The approach to transgender medicine is how do you get the body to align with the mind, not how to get the mind to align with the body. If we had a different starting point, we might have different results, right? This is philosophical, right? Not medical, philosophical. Lastly, Pope Francis points out, technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic. Those surrounded by technology fully understand that it moves forward in a final analysis, neither for profit nor for well-being of the human race, right? Again, this idea that if technology can do something, it will do something. And it doesn't stop and ask the question, but should we, right? Is it good? Finally, we'll look at these questions, and I talk about them a little bit in the introduction, but to really go into all of it, I would be telling you the whole book, right? So, and I'm already almost at an hour, so it's just some of the questions. Is there such thing as a transgender brain, right? Look at chapters 4 through 8. I address that issue in those chapters. How is the transgender part of the LGBTQIA alphabet, right? Well, this is, again, should be examined, especially in terms of law. We have laws now that protect LGBT people, but some of this is attraction, and some of this is desire, and some of this is ideology. So is ideology the same thing as being, right? This debate, right? Is gender dysphoria innate, right? Again, looking to the science, looking to nature as well. Should those in authority encourage a medicalized approach, right? This would have to then look at the medical evidence and say, is this helpful or is this not helpful to people? Is this solving the problem or is this making it worse, right? What is the approach to this? I tend to think it matters what the cause is, right? Again, with the umbrella, you can't, what might work for one group under the umbrella, like early onset gender dysphoria, might be very different than late onset gender dysphoria or gender theorists. Is it possible to treat transgender people without surgeries? This is another one, right? We kind of have the assumption now that, if you recognize that there is gender dysphoria, quickly start doing the transitioning. Is this always the best approach for everyone? Right? Good. We should consider that. And lastly, what should be the church's approach? Right? We have a very different anthropology than materialism or spiritualism, right? Emotivism. I think we have something very important to say on the matter. I think when it comes to Catholic institutions, we need to approach it differently than secular society, and we need to be able to articulate our points, because I think, one, it's helpful, and two, if you can't articulate your points, you're just going to be seen as a conservative, transphobic, hateful, judgmental, fuddy-duddies who don't understand anything, right? Which is how they paint us already. So being able to articulate our point is very important. Okay, so that is it for the introduction and a bit of a summary for the entire book. If you're interested in any more of it, I have made videos for all of the chapters now. Many of the chapters have many parts to them. So, and if you would like a copy of the book, it is down below. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a question in the discussion under the video, and I'm happy to answer anything. Okay, have a great day.